Now this altogether, if it is so complex, this means that migration policy has extremely limited capacities and need to be done specifically and, very importantly, in perspective, better to adapt to migration than to create or stop migration. It's a much better question, adaptation. If the issue is so complex, then asking about costs or benefits of the whole category is an exercise of reduction, right? Then we reduce social reality, the complexity of social reality. We reduce the complexity of certain problems. And we know in political philosophy, reduction is an exercise of political power. I would propose an exercise that we are doing. What is migration? Migration is some kind of a social practice which links societies, right? Migrants are the ones who make this linkage, and then they create this transnational space. So in case we talk about costs and benefits, let's have a transnational accounting, right? Not just a national accounting, which we always do, not just a single block type accounting, but let's have an accounting for receiving, sending countries at the same time. I would like to propose that we look at actually what is happening in terms of migration figures. As you can see, all regions receive migrants, but in case we look at net migration, the balance of migration, then we can see that the regions are extremely different. Some regions, like overall Europe, became an immigrant region, but some regions, most importantly Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe, it has become an out-migrant region, or it has remained an out-migrant region. Now, one more thing, which is very important. You know, this is why I like always looking at both sides of the coin, right? I also checked which are the key sending countries within Europe. So that is to say, which are the key countries which have a migrant population of more than 1 million, right, within Europe, right? I looked all those things. And what came out of this is something very, very nice to look at. So in case you look at which are the countries which have at least 1 million migrants in Europe, then in an alphabetic order, the countries are the following. Albania, right? No surprise, this is what we expected. Algeria, Belarus, Bosnia, France, Germany. Germany is not only receiving, but it's sending as well. Italy has been always famous about emigration. It's maintaining. There is an Italian, quite a big Italian population. It's not just receiving a lot of migrants from Romania, but they also have quite a number outside. The next country is Kazakhstan, Morocco, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Serbia, Turkey, United Kingdom, right? And then Uzbekistan. These are the countries which have at least 1 million people somewhere around Europe. Uzbekistan, don't look for Uzbeks here. They're mainly in Russia, right? So they are not here, right? Okay. Now this is something very important because all countries have to look at things in both ways, right? Most countries are receiving countries and sending countries at the same time. Now let's do the analysis then in a transnational way or a trans-regional way. Let me start with this region, Eastern Europe and most importantly Southeastern Europe. It is a sending region which receives very little outside the region. In case you look at global statistics, this is striking, okay, that this region together with Latin America is the one which sends a lot of people but receives quite a small number of people outside the region, right? Within the region there is movement, but outside, from outside, not much. So it's like Latin America in this way. And then actually it is involved in some kind of an unequal exchange in this respect. What are the reasons and how it looks like? Loss of jobs in the region in the longer run. So this region has suffered a big loss of jobs during the last 20, 30 years. It experiences a loss of younger age groups. It experiences a loss of better educated population, right? We could check it. We have just also finished in a project a big out-migrant survey from Hungary, and then we could see that that was the case. Actually, we lose the gap between the local population and that of the out-migrants is with regard to the UK. So we are sending one of the best population to the United Kingdom, right? Loss of taxes, loss of social security payments. Talk to people who are working on pension funds here. They have a very serious headache. Foreign capital and labor crosses each other. This we know from the literature. So let me put in another way. German capital is using Hungarian, Slovakian, or Polish labor twice. Here, in these countries, plus in Germany itself. And we know capital and labor relations are not equal, right? So it's not equal power. Can we stop this? I don't think so. What I am always saying, we need to manage and adapt to it, right? We need to manage it and adapt to it. We need to develop special techniques instead of crying, because in a region where there is a freedom of movement and there is an enormous disparity of wages, if somebody is expecting that migration would go down substantially just because we give some chocolates to out-migrants to come home, I think that would be an illusion. Nonetheless, we can do clever diaspora politics, right? So that just, we can do all kinds of things. We can learn a lot in this respect, even from Latin America. We can come back to this later. Of course, I'm not hiding out migration can be helpful. In certain cases, in case people don't find jobs here and they can go outside, that can be beneficial. Some people argue that it leads to better education. We professors, we have to teach much better English classes to them because they want to study in English. So that's okay. But the region dramatically needs, and this is a cost-benefit analysis, immigration. Health services and some other spheres badly need migrants. These people, in case they would come here, would compensate. But this is a low immigration region. Not very attractive labor markets are here. There is a highly xenophobic discourse vividly coming out right now in the refugee crisis. The two cannot be really separated because now the hatred here is toward migrants, right? And that's a big category. So this is what this region needs. Now what about Western and Northern Europe? Western and Northern Europe basically receives a large number of benefits out of these people. Capital requires this immigrant labor coming from Eastern Europe also. Never forget that Mr. Cameron or Mrs. Merkel, when they talk about migrants, they tend to give such big speeches where? At car manufacturers, right? Mr. Cameron, just before the election, gave his speech, big speech on immigration, was at a car manufacturer. Why? Because the government talks to capital, right? Dear capital, don't be so greedy because we have some extra points here, right? So that's the way how it goes. Okay. Now, what are the problems in that region, in this region? Loss of jobs because of the capital moving out. Too high wages, too good working conditions. That is to say, the previous working class, which existed in France, in the United Kingdom, and partially in Germany, but Germany is a little bit special in this respect, they have lost a large number of jobs because manufacturing went out. Capital in Europe is not very faithful, so they are looking for benefits, so they left quite a number of problems behind. And one of the solutions for this problem is, of course, migrants, right? Because can you explain in Northern and Western Europe to people that according to the economists, they would need a decline of real wages, let's say 30–40%. I mean, try to be as a politician. I am not going to be that which is going to promote this idea in those countries. So there is an extremely big problem in competitiveness. And then this is very much related to migration, right? So The problem is here, and that's the political problem in a lot of ways, that those classes which lost in this outsourcing of capital are the ones which find the enemy in the immigrants. And now they have a strong political representation. But the problem is far more structural and far more about how the capital is actually moving and the capital is behaving, right? Cultural conflicts are the smokescreen. Just a second, one minute. Yes, cultural conflicts is the smokescreen behind which we can see. We can come back to the refugee problem later. The only thing I would like to promote that instead of the idea of a huge political economy of migrants, I think we have to do a much more complex analysis. What we need to discuss is not whether we want them or don't want them, but how we manage them, how we control for negative consequences, and how we are boosting positive ones. One more thing. I think the language of utility with regard to human beings is also somewhat problematic. So instead of this biopolitics, sometimes I have, such dreams which I read once. Ecuador put forward the migration policy, not who are the best migrants for us, but they said with human mobility towards social equality. It might be a better language. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, my topic is mass immigration, costs and benefits, and I will not apologize for talking about costs and benefits. Let me start with some illusions which are popular in my country, in Germany. And that is the illusion that the migration which we have is an opportunity rather than a problem. Optimists in Germany argue the following way. We have a demographic gap. We do not have enough young people. In the Middle East and in Africa, there are too many young people. So our needs are complementary. We can improve the world by opening the doors in Germany and other rich welfare states and permit poor people who look for a job in the Middle East or in Africa and don't find it there, or even in the Balkans, in Kosovo and Albania, to find a job in Germany. And Germany currently has opened its doors wide. 43% of all refugees and claimants for asylum in the European Union go to just one country, to Germany. And that, of course, means that our doors are far more widely open than elsewhere, and that is because we in Germany, most of all our wrong-headed government, think that this is an opportunity. And this, I think, is wrong. For two reasons. Currently, we expect in between 800,000 and 1 million migrants in Germany this year. And this will not be unique. This is a start of a mass migration of replacement of the population. It's a long-term trend because of low fertility levels in Germany and high fertility levels in the Muslim world as well as in Africa. And it's a long-term trend because of chain migration. Chain migration means that if some people, let's say from Pakistan, are already in Britain, more people from Pakistan will go to Britain. If some people from Turkey are already in Germany, their friends and neighbors want to go to Germany too. And it means if some people in Algeria have friends who are already in France, they will want to go to France rather than to Germany or Britain. So chain migration generates pairs of nations like Pakistan and Britain, or Bangladesh and Britain, or Turkey and Germany, or Algeria and France. The more Syrians we get, the more we will be chained to the fate of Syria in Germany. But let me go to the cost-benefit balance sheet. Germany has a demographic gap, and the ratio between working-age people and the elderly will deteriorate fast in Germany. The burden of the elderly will double within 2 decades. What would be the effect of that? We either could double the social security tax, or we could cut pensions by half, or we could work for a decade longer, something like that. Or, of course, we could apply some mixture of these measures, none of which is popular. Of course, we could mend our problems by migration. What we observe in Germany is migrants, the ones we actually have so far, are poorer schooled than native Germans. Their vocational training is worse than among native Germans. They are poorer, even if they are in Germany for 2 or 3 decades, than native Germans. They are twice as frequently unemployed as native Germans, and twice as frequently they claim transfer benefits. These are not the people who are going to rescue the welfare state. Reality is different. We can observe it. And it's also clear from theory. What is a characteristic of welfare states? Welfare states provide 2 types of incentives. You cannot have a welfare state without being a high taxation state, because somebody has to pay for all these benefits. And so high income receivers face some incentive to go. We heard from the first presentation that Germany is also an emigration country. Of course, high income receivers know that taxation is lower in Switzerland or in the United States than in Germany, and that's why they choose to go to either Switzerland or to the United States. And highly qualified people speak sufficient English to go to the United States and pay lower taxes there rather than higher taxes in Germany. If highly qualified people get out, and then we get people from Albania, from Eastern Turkey, from Syria, with poorer schooling and with less vocational training, then will this rescue our welfare state? If they are twice as frequently unemployed, if they receive welfare benefits twice as frequently as Germans do? No. Our best-known economist, Hans-Werner Sinn from Munich University, has estimated that every migrant we have costs Germany 79,000 euros in his lifetime. So currently we admit a likely financial burden, let's assume for the sake of ease of calculation, that 1 million people are let in by misguided Mrs. Merkel, then this implies that we add a financial burden on the taxpayer of 79 billion euros. Our central government budget is about 300 billion. So if we count that in, actually, we do not balance the books. But politicians have a very strange relationship to the truth and to plain speaking. So the effects of the mass migration we have is, first, human capital deteriorates. And we know that the human capital stock has a very strong relationship to the economic growth rates. And if highly qualified people get out of the tax and welfare state, less qualified people are let into a welfare state, then the human capital stock deteriorates and growth must go down in the long run. And this is one of the few strong and robust relationships in cross-national growth studies. There are very few robust relationships in this kind of quantitative work, which I have done myself, but this is one of them. If those economists who focus on technological change and predict that average is over, that is, that in future the Internet of Things will threaten not only lowly skilled jobs, but average skilled jobs. If this prediction about economic development is true, and nobody knows it for sure, but if it should be true, then this reduced level of human capital would be not only bad, but it would come close to being a catastrophe. Of course, it's clear. I mean, a little bit of common sense. You do not even need to be an economist or a social scientist. Just trust in a little bit of common sense. Can you expect that less developed countries can afford to prepare their young people for employment in rich countries? Is this conceivable? Can we assume that poor countries want to be the good Samaritans for Germany? If you think about this question, then I think you do not need any study to answer that question. Let me make clear one proposition. The poorer a source country is, the less qualified its migrants can be for a richer country. Second, mass migration, if that means that taxpayers face a burden of about 79,000 euros per migrant on average, this implies a reduction of economic freedom, because economic freedom implies limits to taxation. And again, a reduction of economic freedom, that's a second way to reduce your economic growth rates. So the first way to reduce your economic growth rates is have less human capital. The second way to reduce economic growth rates is reduce economic freedom and increase taxation. Third, it's much better to have the rule of law, to have safe property rights. And how do you get safe property rights? How do you get the rule of law? Again, trust a little bit in common sense. My argument only is that the rule of law works best if most people, most of the time, want to obey the law voluntarily. If most people, most of the time, do not want to obey the law, my prediction is that the rule of law does not work. Under what conditions can we expect that most people want to obey the law most of the time? I think the answer is straightforward. The law should conform to the informal norms and the habits which most people obey anyway. So the law should be related to the traditions of a country. I do not argue that traditions are always good, but I do argue that if the law is rooted in tradition, we stand a better chance that the law is not only on paper, but that it has some relation to reality. Let me compare two European countries, extreme cases, and I think of tax laws. In Germany, or even more in Switzerland, most taxpayers actually pay the taxes they ought to pay, at least approximately. And then think of Greece. There almost nobody pays. And this is related somehow to what people are used to traditions. And traditions concerning taxation in Greece and in Germany are not the same. What is the difference between migrants who come from a foreign country and the natives? Of course, the foreigners, the migrants cannot know the local traditions of a country they go to. And since they cannot know, they cannot feel it natural to obey the customs, the habits, and the laws of a country. And that means that mass immigration cannot avoid undermining the rule of law, because the rule of law requires that most of the people want to obey the law of the land because they are used to it. It's no criticism of foreigners to say that they cannot know the habits and informal laws and customs of a foreign country. That's just a statement of fact, and you don't need more than common sense, which our government in Germany currently lacks to a much greater degree than your country here in Hungary. And of course, there are differences, as we heard in the first lecture, between people. The first time I thought about this was more than 10 years ago at a conference of political scientists and economists in Denmark. And they had sufficient data about 3 types of immigrants: Poles, Vietnamese, and Somalis. And the Poles were very close to the Danes themselves, to the indigenous people, in their employment ratios. About 80% of the population between 20 and 65 in Denmark works. Among Poles, it was 70%. So the cultural difference between Protestant Danes and Catholic Poles doesn't make so much difference. Some difference, because the Poles were foreigners, they didn't know all the customs of Denmark, but it was not too bad. Among the Vietnamese in those days, it was 40% who worked instead of 80 or 70. And among the Somalis, it was 10. This brings me to 2 more propositions. The poorer a country is, and Somalia is much poorer than Vietnam, and the more slowly growing a country is, the less likely it is that migrants from there are likely to find a job in a richer economy. And of course, cultural distance also matters, and that's why the Poles, being Europeans, did so much better in Denmark than people from non-European countries. But now let me come to an even more important point, which our government forgets in contrast to yours. My next point is cultural heterogeneity reduces political stability. Think a little bit about those poor Syrians. What is a characteristic of Syria? It's a culturally heterogeneous country. There are various kinds of Muslim sects. There are Sunnis and Shias. And there is a Shia branch, the Alawites. There are even Arab Christians. And there are not only Arabs, there are also Kurds in Syria. And this cultural heterogeneity is related to the civil war which is raging in this country. Or think of neighboring Iraq. Again, Arabs and Kurds. Again, Shias and Sunnis, and Yazidis, a smaller group, a few of which are also in Syria. I just forgot to mention them. Or, taking an example closer to your home country, the former Yugoslavia, there have been Catholic Croats and Slovenes, Muslim Kosovars and Bosnians, and Orthodox Serbs and Macedonians. They didn't get along too well Or think of Rwanda with its Tutsis and Hutus. Or think of Nigeria, where the Biafra War was the bloodiest war since African independence between Igbos on the one hand and Yorubas and Hausas on the other side. Or even think of the United States, where the relationship between black and white is not so extremely happy either. So my argument is that cultural heterogeneity as such threatens political stability and makes civil war more likely. And if you want to assess the impact of migration on political stability, do not look to the numbers for the entire population. Look at the numbers for children, because those who are children now will certainly survive me. So if I look in Germany only at people below the age of 10, then in Germany the ratio of foreign-born or born to foreign parents to indigenous Germans is already 1/3. 1/3 of children below 10 in Germany already is of foreign stock. And most of them do not come from neighboring countries like Poland or Portugal, like Hungary or Italy. Most of them come from a Muslim background, from a different civilization. So cultural heterogeneity at home leads to political instability and the risk of civil war. The refugees come from such countries like former Yugoslavia a decade ago, like Syria and Iraq today. But the refugees bring the problems of cultural heterogeneity to their destination country. And can it be in the national interest of any country to welcome them in huge numbers? Is it the task of the government to serve the interests of foreign refugees more than the interests of its nationals? Let me make some final statements. What is the heritage of the Western world? What is special about the Western world? And now I'm talking not about Germany, not about Hungary, not about the United States or Britain. All these 4 countries which I mentioned, in my mind, are part of the Western world. And let me summarize the Western heritage not by reference to religion, as many people frequently do, Christian values. I said before, I'm an agnostic, so this is not what I would want to do. I would say that Western civilization is characterized by acknowledgement of self-ownership of people, and if everybody belongs to himself, this means you don't belong to your government, you belong to yourself. And if you earn a lot of money, it belongs to yourself in the first instance and not to your government. 100% taxation would mean state slavery and not self-ownership. And that's why the second characteristic of the Western heritage after self-ownership is limited government. And if I want to explain why Western Europe and the Western offshoots like the United States could overcome the great Asian civilizations which were more advanced 500 or 1,000 years ago than we were, I would say it's because we invented limited government. And we invented economic freedom, which is impossible to have without limited government. And if you have limited government and economic freedom, you also could say this package is, we invented capitalism. Let's be honest about it. And capitalism and prosperity are prerequisites of political freedom. But what is the value of political freedom or democracy? if we elect governments, as we fools in Germany have done, who put the interest of foreigners ahead of the interests of German taxpayers and German voters. Is democracy meaningful if the government does not feel responsible to its citizens, to its taxpayers, to its voters? I would argue that we started to endanger Western civilization when we institutionalized the welfare state, because the welfare state institutionalized humanitarian concerns for fellow citizens. We made a second mistake with development aid, because that extended benefits to foreigners. By the way, the effectiveness of foreign aid is debatable. And now, some of our governments feel responsible for all the poor and needy in the world. And this, of course, means that any responsibility to its own citizens, in particular to its own taxpayers, has withered away. I'm not against all immigration, but I'm certainly against the immigration which we have. As Milton Friedman suggested decades ago, you can have open borders, but you cannot have a welfare state at the same time. If government welfare payments to refugees were zero, and if they depended only on private charity, I'm sure less than 800,000 or 1 million would come to Germany. And those who would come would be much more likely to work and to contribute to our society. Thank you for your attention.
Now, let me refer to the analysis we have done about the skill needs and about mobility and how it is needed in this context. And what we have to do, and we cannot avoid that, is that, well, we have shrinking working age population, and we need to, I mean, if we want to keep up a prosperous and dynamic Europe, well, we have to replace, we have to fill up newly emerging jobs, and we have to replace people who are retiring. We have to fill in the skill shortages and deficiencies. And we asked 234 labor market experts from Europe, but also from the US, who are working on issues related to Europe. What do you think about immigration? Does Europe need more immigrants? About equal numbers of immigrants? What do you think about high-skilled immigration, low-skilled immigration? And essentially, almost 90% of these people say that the EU needs at least as many immigrants as it has now, and 57.7% of these experts claim that we need more immigrants. The perception was slightly more favorable in terms of towards high-skilled immigration, but also the balance was in favor of low-skilled immigration as well. If you look at migration figures for Europe, well, we do have migration flows. Compared to the rest of the world, European Union is not very mobile entity. I mean, the people in European Union are not very mobile. The interstate mobility in European Union is just about 1%, maybe slightly higher now. But for the US, it's 3%, and for the Russian Federation, it's 1.7% of people moving annually across state borders. Of course, there it matters. Measurement is a bit tricky because how we draw borders matters, but still this gives you a flavor. But if you look at immigration history of the past 20 years, what you see is that, and let's try to put the current immigration crisis in perspective, in context. Well, we do remember the enlargement, post-enlargement migration. We remember Romanians, Bulgarians moving to Western Europe mainly, the same for the countries that joined the European Union in 2004. And current immigration from the, current refugee, the current wave of immigration is comparable to the immigration from the new member states, from just the EU 10 countries, meaning those that entered the European Union in 2004. It's quite at par for 2014 with the figures for migration from new member states of 2004 to Western Europe in 1 year, just 1 year, 2010. Okay, so that was what happened in 2014 was similar to that migration in 2010. This year's figure is slightly higher, but it's still smaller than migration from Romania and Bulgaria to Western Europe in 2007. Just to understand it, and this is just a fraction of total migration still. We understand there is a lot of other migration from rest of Europe, rest of the world, within Western Europe migration, etc. So just to understand that I do understand the imminence of this migration. I do understand that it's concentrated in certain countries, but we should also understand that in the context of whole Europe, these are not awfully large numbers. We have had at least as much and more migration through different channels. So the critics would say, okay, well, fine, we may need migration, okay, we need to fill up some skills, but immigrants are unskilled. They take our jobs, they lower the wages, abuse the welfare system, and there is welfare tourism. They go to countries which are welfare generous. They increase crime. And I ask a question, well, is this true really? If you look at data, hard evidence, is this true or not? So let me just walk you through a couple of reflections on what data and analysis of data tells us about these issues that I mentioned. First, education. Well, the estimate, migration, as Professor Melek has said, it's a fluid phenomenon. The nature of migration makes it really difficult to measure it. But the figures about skills of migrants are that about more than 20 and maybe less than 30, but somewhere between 20 and 30% of them have higher education. I'm not sure about Hungary, but this is certainly more than in many European countries. Okay. If you look at migration from the European Union neighborhood, meaning essentially the belt around the eastern, southern belt around Europe, education level of those migrants in the European Union there is variation across countries, but they are not systematically different from the education level of natives in those countries. Somewhat lower in the, let's call them old member states, EU 15, and somewhat higher in new member states. The figure for migration for immigrants from further away from the European Union than the neighboring belt is even higher. The education level of these immigrants are even higher in most European countries, actually higher than the education level of natives. This is from the EU Labor Force Survey. Then we might say, well, fine, okay, so they are skilled, but they do not go to places and to sectors and to jobs where they are needed. They work in somewhere else. So we run another study where we asked the question, well, in which sectors do we find immigrants? Is it true that we find them in those sectors where skill shortages are, or where skill shortages are growing? Do those sectors and occupations with growing skill shortages, do they attract more immigrants? The answer is yes. And immigrants are more fluidly responding to skill shortages than natives. And interestingly, this is more true for low-skilled immigrants than high-skilled immigrants. Okay? I could show you a diagram, but we don't have PowerPoint, so I leave it with that. Another critique could be, well, okay, but they go to those sectors, but they take our jobs. They go to sectors where they are needed, but then I cannot work there. Well, there is plenty of evidence on this, and in fact, evidence is that they do not take over jobs, they actually create new jobs in the long run. So just to give you a few examples of historical events where this was studied, but this has been studied in several contexts around the globe, and the conclusion is very, very consistent. If you've heard of Mariel boat lift, these were about 125,000 Cuban refugees shipped to Miami within a few months. It's 2-3 months, 100,000 people, new people in Miami. And the question was, well, did this affect the labor market in Miami? Did this increase unemployment or lowered wages? And the answer is no. Okay. You could question that study, but then there is plenty of follow-up evidence on in different contexts. For example, post-enlargement mobility in the European Union. You should understand that it was about 3 million people moving from new member states to old member states just over 5 years, 2004 to 2009. 3 million people moved. Did we find any negative effects in Dublin or in the UK, elsewhere? In Dublin, it was pretty, it was a huge migration wave within just a few months and years. And if you look at, you can run fancy statistics, fancy econometrics, whatever, but if you just look at the development of the wage in Ireland, there is nothing, no bump, nothing. There is no change at the period no change in the trend, when this very significant immigration wave occurred. And let me be a bit populist now, let me abuse this a bit. What do you think, how many jobs there are in the United States with 300 million immigrants? I guess unemployment rate is very low, and there are as many jobs as people have created as these immigrants, all of them have created. We understand that immigration societies are able to create jobs, and immigration has not, from evidence shows that immigration has not increased unemployment, and it has not lowered wages. Now the next question could be, all right, so they come, they go to sectors where they are needed, they do not steal our jobs, okay, but they abuse our welfare state. All right, so we look at this, we looked at the European Union Survey of Income and Living Conditions, which is a data set which is collected in all European Union countries. And we looked at all types of social support and the rate at which immigrants and natives are taking any support. Okay? Poland, France, Finland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden are the 6 countries where immigrants do have slightly higher welfare take-up than the natives. Austria, Belgium, Netherlands, Czech Republic, Iceland, UK, Norway are those where they are essentially similar. There is no statistical difference. UK, Norway, Ireland, Luxembourg, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Cyprus, Spain have lower. Immigrants have lower welfare take-up than natives. So you see, at least what we see is that the picture is more complex than just saying, oh, they abuse welfare. There is variation. And actually, in most European countries, they do not take up more welfare than natives. They're not more frequent users of welfare than the natives. But, okay, maybe we are hiding something here because they are young and they don't take pension, or maybe they don't have kids and they don't take those kind of benefits. So let's be a bit picky. Let's try to expose them. Let's look at unemployment benefits. Okay, let's look at unemployment support. And there we got them, because there immigrants are more frequent welfare takers in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 2/3 of the European Union countries. Okay, fair enough. Let's then try to make a simple exercise that, well, maybe, they come and maybe they're not able to immediately find a job, maybe they have to adjust a bit, so maybe we are slightly unfair to them when we just look at the raw figures. So let's just compare similar natives and similar immigrants. Let's try to control for some of their characteristics. If we do so, then immigrants are still more likely to be in unemployment benefit take-up in 8 countries of the European Union, less frequently taking unemployment benefits in 3 countries, and the rest is not distinguishable. So the picture is leaning now slightly towards immigrants that, well, maybe if you are a bit fairer to them, the picture has changed. But then, let's run the third exercise. Let's now compare immigrants and natives with similar characteristics and those who are actually in high risk of unemployment, those who actually need it, those who actually are, for whom unemployment benefits are intended. There is no country in the European Union where immigrants would be more frequent takers of unemployment benefits when we compare similar, apples to apples, than natives. There are 6 countries, Spain, Belgium, Cyprus, Sweden, Ireland, and the Netherlands, where they're actually significantly less likely to obtain unemployment benefits when they are in the situation that they need it. And so I would rather change the question or change the perspective, and I would say this is not about abuse, this is about lack of access. Another perspective on this is welfare shopping. So the idea is that migrants go to countries which are welfare generous. True, economic theory would predict something like this. Welfare benefits, they actually lower your risk. You come to a country and you become unemployed, you're sick or something, then it provides a certain support. That's pretty good. As economic actors, we like it. And so we might be tempted to go to countries which are generous in terms of welfare. So let's look at data, whether data show this or not. Borjas, Harvard economist, has studied this, and he indeed found really small but statistically significant effects, marginally significant, it says here, among the US states. So in the US, he looked at some welfare benefits, and he found that, okay, migrants do respond, not very much, but slightly, yes. We studied, a colleague studied this for European Union, and they found insignificant and very small effects. And we ran our own analysis, and we found essentially 0 effects. And we also showed that if you get somehow positive effect of welfare generosity on migration, this is likely to be because of what we call reverse causality. That means that migrants go to some countries and then generosity increases, rather than migrants go to countries which are welfare generous. Okay, tough luck. I'm not able to prove the claims that I made in the beginning. But there is another one, which is that they are not contributing to welfare enough, to welfare state enough. Well, there is not so many studies about this because, as you can imagine, these effects are really complex. I mean, if immigrants come, they pay taxes, they pay social security, they have effects on their fellow workers, they have kids or not, they have all of that. How much time have I got? 2 minutes, okay, great. But our colleagues from University College London found that they actually have contributed to public finances in the UK. Okay. Country studies. We ran several country studies for different projects. General results: immigrants provide productive capacity and human capital, fill up gaps, help to mobilize internal capacities, do not negatively affect wages employment, do not abuse welfare. We heard this. So this was country level evidence. We then thought, well, maybe these micro level interactions are hiding something. Maybe we should look at the macro level. Maybe we should look at macro variables and see what happens there. So we looked at the effects of migration on GDP, GDP per capita, employment rate, and output per worker. What we found was positive effects, positive and significant effects on GDP, GDP per capita, and the employment rate. Employment rate goes up. I mean, it's true that immigrants have higher levels of unemployment, but it's also true they have higher levels of participation in many countries, and all in all, they end up having higher level of employment rate, and they also increase employment rate of the natives. We found a negative effect on output per worker. Not so surprising, they go in a country, they adjust, and during the period they need to adjust, they are less productive, migrants themselves. The last point, okay, fair enough, economics. We cannot, we rather find the evidence leans more on the positive side than negative side, but they are criminals. Okay? We don't like immigration because criminals come. Well, again, we asked data, not me, but this was colleagues from the profession who looked at whether immigration increases crime. Evidence, it does not. If there is an increase in property crime, not violent crime, but property crime, that's due to lack of labor market integration. So if there is, on average, in general, there is no evidence that immigrants would increase crime, but there is a finding that lack of integration does increase property crime. So, conclusions. Europe needs immigrants, mainly high-skilled ones, at least skilled ones who can be, who can fulfill their potential in our labor markets. We do have some, but also because our deficient migration policy, we are losing the best. Also because maybe some other reasons. Our migration and integration policies are rather problematic, but in spite of all that, in spite of all the mistakes I think we are making in migration management, immigrants in the European Union contribute to GDP, GDP per capita, taxes, labor market efficiency, and there is no negative effect, no detectable negative effect on wages or employment of the natives. They do respond to labor market skills, gaps, labor market shortages, more fluidly than the natives, and in particular, these are low-skilled immigrants, so maybe we need low-skilled immigrants as well. I'm finished now. So my bottom line is that we need more and not less mobility. We need more and not less migration. And the last point, very quickly, how I see the current migration crisis in Europe. Current migration crisis in Europe offers a potential for a triple win. Number one, providing humanitarian help to refugees. Number two, we have the chance to revamp and reform our asylum, migration, and integration policies, to make them robust and to make them, to enable us to deal with these kind of things, and to enable us to get, from the economic perspective, to get most talented migrants who are willing to come to our countries, and we can benefit from their hands and brains that can help us to solve and they can help us to boost our labor markets. Otherwise, a triple loss looms. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to kick off with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in America. Interestingly, both sides, both in the Republican primaries and the Democratic primaries, both these two have led on one economic point, which is that labor in America, low-cost labor, is losing out because of mass immigration. What is their point? It is that low-income natives lose, well-off natives, but higher-income natives gain, and capital gains. And let's look what Bernie Sanders. You can't get more left-wing than Bernie Sanders. He's not Donald Trump. This is what he said. Open borders, that's a right-wing proposal. Did you know that? Which says, essentially, there is no United States. It would make everybody in America poorer. And of course, Trump has said pretty much the same sort of thing. And it's the electorate is realizing, what does this mean? Immigration, let's put it in economic terms, redistributes income from newly plentiful factors of production, to newly scarce factors of production. In other words, labour's gone from being scarce to being plentiful. And unfortunately, our politicians, our media, and our academia even, I dare say, along with, of course, businessmen as well, belong to the class that gains. Generally, they're speaking, they belong to the higher income class. But also, academia, media, and politicians have another thing in their favour, that is that they depend for their jobs on a mastery of native language and culture, and that you cannot compete with if you've just suddenly arrived in a new country. I couldn't become a member of the Hungarian Parliament or be a professor at a Hungarian university. Even no, that's not the case. It's much more. So we discussed one point, which is the effect on labour income. Bad news for lower paid workers. But let's just be reasonable. There is possible beneficiary immigration. It's possible to envisage immigration of people who have higher skills and even more capital than natives. The reason I say capital is this. If you look at there's a very good quotation from a book which was published in America 20 years ago when Congress asked all the American economists to produce a report on the economics of migration. And this is what it said, just only 3 lines. If immigrants have the same skill distribution as domestic workers, and if they have brought sufficient capital with them, this is the bit most people forget about, to maintain the US capital labor ratio, then natives will neither benefit nor lose from immigration. And obviously this leaves out various things like transitional costs, cultural costs, and so on. But let's just stick to this for the moment. So the vast majority of migrants don't bring any capital with them, obviously, and the vast majority have inferior skills. But it is possible to envisage countries, and it has happened in the past. I mean, you know, British people could emigrate to Pakistan. That would probably raise Pakistan's gross domestic product. And in the past, Europeans migrated to Australia and to the New World. And in fact, the first fleet which went to Australia actually carried its capital equipment with it on board. It had machines, it had animals, and everything like that. And so when they arrived in Australia, although they weren't no doubt wanted by the Aborigines, the fact of the matter is that the GDP of Australia per head increased, because you added together the European GDP and the Aborigine GDP, it was higher than it was before the Europeans arrived. And that's also a characteristic of modern Israel as well. So my point is this: when I mentioned capital earlier, it's very important. Think about it. When an immigrant steps off an aeroplane or arrives here in Hungary, they need capital immediately. They need a lot of capital. And where are they going to get it from? They make use of the airports, the roads, the water supplies, and later they need housing, colleges, churches, and all the rest of it, and factories, and factory equipment. And generally speaking, this need for capital equipment, capital wealth, or if you like to call it, is ignored by our politicians and commentators who only generally talk about the effect on GDP. So when an immigrant worker arrives, the wealth of the country is being shared among more people. And therefore each person in the country, native, and the natives have less wealth than they did have before. That's common sense. Now the question is, how does an immigrant build up his wealth? Remember that the native workers have accumulated the wealth over hundreds of years, quite often. If you think about drained marshes and all that sort of thing going back to the Middle Ages. We in England have got colleges in Oxford and Cambridge hundreds of years old. We've inherited capital. We've inherited the railways were built 200 years ago, whatever it was, canals and so forth. So how does an immigrant worker get capital? Now, you might think, well, he's earning money, he saves money, but it's a pitiful amount, pitiful. The average worker, the average native worker, only saves in the UK around about, both himself and his employer, saves only about £2,000 a year. And whereas an immigrant family needs, an immigrant with one dependent needs about £141,000. Those figures are some years old, but of course, because of the recession, they haven't changed a great deal. So where are they actually going to get it? Well, there are three ways they get it. The first way is simply that native wages are reduced and capitalists benefit. Now, this is nicely quoted by our friends in the American study. It is quite a complicated quotation, but it's worth listening to. As already mentioned, in the short run, the influx of new labour is likely to depress the capital-labour ratio before it is restored through new investment. Indeed, it is this higher return to capital that, in part, is thought to induce an increased volume investment that ultimately restores the capital-labour ratio to its pre-immigration level. God, those are long words. I'm sorry to inflict them on you. But they mean that that native wages fall and capital gains. And then because the capital gains, eventually they decide to put in a bit more money and eventually wages return to the pre-immigration level. That's actually quite unlikely, in fact, but that is the theory. But also, natives lose because part of the money for supplying immigrants with the capital they need immediately is taken away by taxation to build the roads, extra roads that are needed, and to build all the government buildings that are needed and so forth, and also by another factor, which is the diversion of investment. Capitalists, as soon as a lot of immigrants appear, immediately decide, well, there's perhaps more money to be made in making some high labor content commodity rather than investing in something else. So there's diversion of capital, taxation, and reduction in wages. So all these things are really bad for natives. And I wonder why often there's this kind of belief among politicians that it doesn't really matter, none of this really matters. They think that actually wealth, capital equipment, is actually quite easy to accumulate, quite easy to distribute to others. I mean, quite a lot of politicians actually think like that. And then another thing one needs to consider at this point is the moral argument. Is it right to depress the wages of native workers? Is it socially and morally right to deliberately depress the earnings of native workers and divert capital in order to provide capital and wealth for immigrants? Because they've got to get it from somewhere, haven't they? Where are they going to get it from other than that? So what happens when the immigrant worker doesn't have capital with him? Remember, they're not building a whole society in a deserted island somewhere. They're moving in on an existing capital structure. So you get crowding in. They use dwellings more intensively, they overload transport, water resources, and all these things. And as our very left-wing National Institute in Britain pointed out, for each pair of hands, income rises less in proportion because there's no extra capital. In other words, you've got too many labourers and not enough equipment for these labourers. So that means that the capital is diverted to supplying the needs of immigrants. It's quite a complex idea, this. And it's not something that is generally put forward. So what are the, and coming to the logical conclusion of this, not only is the per capita gross domestic product of the new combined workforce of immigrants and natives reduced below the previous per capita gross domestic product by the effects of immigration, but so is the wealth of the natives, their standard of living, and also, therefore, by inference, their future production. So for natives, the whole process of immigration is really bad news. I mean, initial losses, immense dislocation, reduced production per head, a reduction in the standard of living due to wealth dilution, with the ultimate result that if you're really lucky, the capital labour ratio is restored to the previous level, as you were. And in fact, this is not actually the case. Now, because of all this, and most people who look into the economics of migration, come to the conclusion that it's a really bad news for native workers, and pretty clearly Trump and Sanders are buying into that. Lots of new ideas have been put forward. I'm just going to touch on them briefly, and then finally, just very briefly, on some other moral factors. I mean, we are told, for example, we need more migrants because we haven't got enough workers in the future. Well, it's been pointed out so many times, I mean, by almost every respectable body in the world, this just won't work because you need migration. Migrants get old as well. In fact, if you go back to 1900, the number of workers in relation to the number of the elderly, what they call the support ratio, was about, goodness knows what, 20 to 1? It's now about 4 to 1 in the UK. And I mean, on the whole, we managed, in the whole of the last century, to reduce the support ratio without having to have massive immigration. Every person who's looked into this business of needing migrants to support the elderly population, that is the Council of Europe, the United Nations, OECD, has concluded that it's a completely blind argument. Then we're told another thing is that, which Professor Weed has dealt with about the social security. I mean, it's just obvious that the whole welfare state is designed to transfer money to lower income people. That's common sense. We're also told that another thing they've started talking about is that migrants are the brightest and the best. Really good people migrate. Did you know that? I mean, I don't think most people don't know what they're talking about. Migration in the UK, for example, most of it is very, very narrow. 70%, I'll just give you one example, 70% of migration from Pakistan comes from a very small district called Mirpur, with 2 adjoining districts called Kotla and Bimba, in Azad Kashmir, which is the Pakistan part of Kashmir. 70% of Pakistanis originate in that very small area. It's got a population of about 2 million people. I've never met a Pakistani, ever, in the UK, who comes from Karachi, which has got 20 million people. But I've met lots and lots of people who come from Mirpur. The same thing applies to India. About 60% it is thought of Indians in the UK, till recently anyway, come from one district, Jalandhar, in Punjab, in Indian Punjab. Jalandhar is I think I'm right in saying it's the 256th most populated districts in India. There are 600 districts in India. So it's a tiny area. And that's where these people come from. To pretend that these obscure rural areas have got the best and the brightest is just ridiculous. And I like Professor Borges, our great expert from Harvard on immigration, who does keep telling us that most of these arguments are indeed ridiculous, ludicrous arguments, which have actually only been put forward because the main economic argument doesn't wash. And now, just briefly, just think about a couple of moral things. So we've just talked about why natives, is it moral to reduce income among natives? I mean, clearly Trump and Sanders are saying, no, it isn't moral, and they're not, and it's politically unattractive to American workers. And then we've also talked about, is it morally just that capital equipment is provided for immigrants by cutting wages for native workers and cutting investment from them? But there's one thing where immigrants get a really bad turn of the wheel as well. That is, of course, because most Western governments have already got huge liabilities. When you become an immigrant, you arrive here in Budapest or in London, you suddenly, assuming you're an average person, average wages, you become dependent for a large chunk of the national debt, which has been already incurred before you've even got here. That's not a very good deal. Is that moral? I would suggest not. The debt in the UK, again, is so enormous that it will probably never be paid, but theoretically, it's much higher than, for example, a migrant would take on to buy a house. It's around about, I think, about £5 trillion. So from the point of view of a migrant, he's being asked to arrive here and now pay, not for debts which is going to be any use to him, but debts were already incurred the day before he got here. And I can't see that other than that's a long-term sort of peonage type system. And of course, the only way to get out of it is if it's kicked down the road in a Ponzi scheme where new immigrants arrive in a few years' time and that it can be transferred to them. Now, one final point. How much time have I got, Jerry? 1 minute. 2 minutes, God. I was going to talk a lot about the EU more, the EU and how the EU politicians love migration. You know, they're like the old Roman legionaries. You know, the Roman emperors used to post retired legionaries in the outskirts of the empire. And the EU is really keen on moving people around. Really, really keen. Because people who move around, Hungarians living in Britain, Britons living in Hungary, tend to be supporters of the EU. So the more of them, the better. And they've also discovered a new idea. People from outside are even more keen on the EU. So the more of them, the better. The second thing about our political leaders in the EU is that they, the more diverse a society, I'm only about a minute to go, Jerry, politicians gain power because they're the people who are in charge. There are more problems. Politicians solve them. So we need more power for the politicians. Politicians like complications. They like problems. They may never solve them. That doesn't really matter, but they're still there. For them, it keeps them being. And also, there are more government programs, and politicians are the one who promise that the government programs will be supported. So they like that as well. And finally, the last thing of all, it gives them an opportunity for this wonderful new American expression to what they call virtue signaling, to signal that they're virtuous. It means that they can say that they're in faith. These things like immigration and asylum policies are the sort of have a moral quality. Now, I compare them, of course, with the Pharisees in the Bible. You remember the Pharisees? They used to do two things, yeah? One thing, they used to go to the top table and sit there and were bowed and scraped to as they went. And the other thing, when the collection box was passed round, they ostentatiously put a lot of money in it. Now, our politicians have simplified that now. They still go to the top table, but they don't put their own money in the collection box. They put your money in the collection box instead. It's much simpler, isn't it? Okay.